The real history of Vikings. Imagine the roar of ocean waves crashing against a wooden longship, its curved dragon-headed prow slicing through the mist. A cold wind howls across the North Sea. At the helm, a bearded warrior grips the oar, eyes fixed on the unknown shore ahead. These were the Vikings. Not just warriors, but farmers, sailors, explorers, and conquerors. For over 2 centuries, they were the most feared people in Europe. This is not myth. This is history. The term Viking comes from the Old Norse word Viking, meaning pirate or raider. But Vikings weren't a single tribe or kingdom. They sailed west to the British Isles and Ireland. They sailed south to France and Spain. Around the year 1000 AD, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, set sail from Greenland and reached a mysterious land across the Atlantic. He called it Vinland, a place many historians believe was in North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus. That makes the Vikings the first known Europeans to set foot on the American continent. They even went east, deep into modern-day Russia, navigating rivers and setting up trade routes with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. They established thriving colonies in places like Dublin in Ireland, York in England, and Normandy in France. In 865 AD, a massive force of Viking warriors, known as the Great Heathen Army, invaded England. Many Vikings began to settle permanently in the lands they had once raided. They married locals, converted to Christianity, and merged into European society. By the late 11th century, the Viking Age faded, not with a dramatic final battle, but slowly, as the world they had dominated changed. Led by legendary warriors like Ivar the Boneless, they conquered large parts of the country and demanded tribute and knife, which come from Old Norse. In place names across Europe, in the legends of fearless warriors and seafaring kings, and in the idea that with courage and curiosity, even the coldest seas can lead to discovery. The English kingdoms were forced to unite against this threat, and the struggle between Saxon and Viking would define England for decades. Yes, Normandy, named after the Northmen who settled there. They believed that if they died bravely, they would be taken to Valhalla, a great hall where fallen warriors feasted and fought forever. They held things, assemblies where free men debated laws and settled disputes. Their art, jewelry, and storytelling show a rich and complex culture, not just brute force. Their religion, based on Norse mythology, was full of gods like Odin, the wise and all-seeing, Thor, the hammer-wielding protector, and Loki, the cunning trickster. Their sagas told of fate, courage, and the ultimate doom of the gods in Ragnarok, the end of the world. One of those descendants, William the Conqueror, would go on to change the course of English history in 1066. The Swedish Vikings, known as the Russ, helped found the early Russian state and established a powerful trading network across Eastern Europe. They were Norse seafarers from what we now call Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The answer lies in the land itself. Scandinavia was rugged and cold, with limited farmland, overpopulation, internal conflict, and the lure of riches abroad pushed many to take to the seas. They sought treasure, land, and glory. And they found it. But they didn't just attack. They explored, traded, and built connections across vast distances. Their age, the Viking Age, began in the late 8th century, around 793 AD, when they raided the monastery at Lindisfarne in northern England. The raid was sudden, brutal, and marked the beginning of a new era. So, why did the Vikings leave their homeland? Viking longships were masterpieces of design, swift, flexible, and capable of sailing in both open seas and shallow rivers. These ships gave the Vikings a terrifying advantage. They could strike without warning and disappear before a counterattack could form. Towns along the English, Irish, and French coasts lived in constant fear. But the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were brilliant navigators and bold explorers. Perhaps the most remarkable Viking voyage was to the west, beyond the known world. Back in Europe, the Vikings began to shift from raiders to settlers. But let's not forget, the Vikings were still feared warriors. What made Viking warriors so deadly was indeed just their strength or weapons. It was their mindset. To a Viking, death in battle was glorious. Despite their fearsome image, Vikings were deeply connected to their families, traditions, and laws. So how did the Viking Age end? As Europe became more organized and kingdoms stronger, the Viking raids became harder to sustain. Yet their legacy lives on in our words like sky, window, and knife, which come from Old Norse, in place names across Europe, in the legends of fearless warriors and seafaring kings, and in the idea that with courage and curiosity, even the coldest seas the Viking Age expanded across continents. What happened on the battlefield was only one side of the story. Behind the fierce warriors in iron helmets and swinging axes were entire communities, rich with culture, customs, and complexity. Viking society wasn't a wild chaos of raiders. It was surprisingly structured. At the top were jarls, the nobles, and beneath them were carls, the everyday free men, farmers, craftsmen, traders, and sailors. At the bottom were thralls, or slaves, often captured during raids. They didn't just burn villages, they built them. They didn't only destroy, they also preserved, traded, and mixed with other cultures. In Normandy, Viking settlers became French nobles. In England, they integrated into Saxon society. In Eastern Europe, Norse traders helped shape the early Russian state. Yet even thralls could eventually earn freedom. An upward movement in Viking society was possible. If you were bold enough, it still exists today, making it the oldest surviving parliament in the world. Despite their reputation, most Vikings weren't warriors. In the languages we speak, the maps we read, and even the DNA of millions of people across Europe and beyond, important individuals were laid to rest in elaborate ceremonies, sometimes even buried in ships, surrounded by weapons, treasure, and sacrificed animals. Some were burned on pyres, their ashes believed to carry them to Valhalla, the great hall of the slain. Others were buried with coins, payment to cross into the afterlife. There were farmers and settlers. They raised cattle, grew barley and rye, built homes with turf and wood, and lived close to the land. Powerful kingdoms like England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire had learned to defend themselves. Castles rose, armies grew, and Christian missionaries spread their faith deep into Scandinavia. The English king Harold Godwinson defeated a massive Norse army led by Harald Hardrada, one of the last great Viking kings. But the Viking spirit of courage, adventure, and resilience never truly disappeared. Just weeks later, Harold himself would fall at the Battle of Hastings to William the Conqueror, a descendant of Vikings. The irony is deep. Viking blood helped shape both the end and the beginning of a new era in Europe. Many Vikings converted to Christianity, voluntarily or by force. With it came new laws, new leaders, and new priorities. During the warmer months, they'd farm. In the colder months, they'd gather in longhouses, telling tales of gods and monsters by firelight. Law was enforced through local councils called things, where disputes were debated publicly. Justice could be harsh, exile, outlaw status, or worse, but it was guided by community, not tyranny. Their oral traditions were rich, stories passed down as sagas, later written in the runic alphabet, sleek, flexible, and terrifying to behold. Viking longships were symbols of their power. They could travel through narrow rivers, across open oceans, and even be carried over land. These ships were fast, capable of reaching speeds over 15 knots, and their shallow drafts allowed them to land almost anywhere. They made the Vikings not just a people, but a force of nature. And it wasn't just men who shaped Viking culture. Viking women had more rights than most of their European counterparts. They could own land, divorce husbands, and run farms. Some were even buried with weapons. leading some historians to believe that female warriors, like the legendary Valkyries, may not have been purely myth. Family and honor were everything in Norse culture. Feuds could last generations, and honor could be won or lost in a single act. Of course, one of the most iconic aspects of Viking life was their ships. Viking expansion wasn't just about raids, it was about ambition, survival, and adaptation. And in Iceland, a Viking parliament, the Althing, was founded in 938. Even in death, the Vikings honored tradition. Burials were sacred. But as the 11th century drew to a close, the Viking world began to change. The once pagan warriors who worshipped Odin and Thor now knelt before the Christian cross. The final chapter of the Viking Age is often linked to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. By then, the longships had mostly stopped sailing. The era of bold raids and vast exploration had faded. Their legacy can still be seen today in the names of days: Wednesday, Thursday, and in our imagination, where the Vikings live on as larger-than-life figures. Fearless, relentless, and unforgettable. Ask and lead to discovery. They were not just raiders. They were not just explorers. They were a force that reshaped the medieval world. They were the Vikings, and their saga still echoes across the winds of history. If you discovered this video on the history of the Vikings and found it interesting, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.